my name is Lisa Tripathi, and today I'm going to be presenting Glass Mountain, a full-length analysis delving into the elements of metafiction. So before we proceed to analyze this piece, I think it's important to know a little bit about the author. So this was written by Donald Barthelme. Hopefully I'm not butchering the name, but he lived from 1931 to 1989, and he's the guy on the right. He's written stories such as Glass Mountain, and it's one of the many stories and novels that he's written. And a lot of his writings actually reflect a lot of the writing style of like postmodernism. So it's just something to keep in mind. So some important points to keep in mind is that this tells the story of a Nordic fairy tale, but in a different way, because this story is almost considered as plagiarism, and a big reason why is because almost all of it is the same except of the plot twist at the end, which definitely changes the ending. So a brief analysis is going to be essentially the preview of what we're going to be analyzing. So this would include, the tone. It's very mellow but serious. The format of this piece, it's only 100 lines, varying lengths, but we'll definitely go into depth for that. And some of the literary elements, such as symbolism, metaphors, and imagery. And that's just only a few of the elements. I found a lot of them, but these are, I found, the most important. And definitely the connotation of certain words affecting the message being portrayed. We're not going to analyze that too much, but it's something to keep in mind. So the format. So this piece has 100 lines. It's very important to take into account that. And the weird thing is it has almost like the format of a poem because it's so short. And each line in, the story would represent a paragraph, and the lines are no more than 2 lines in the dot given. So the tone, it's important to understand that the piece is not meant to be like depressing. The first time I read it, I assumed that, this is a really depressing piece. I thought the ending was really weird. But I noticed that it's supposed to essentially draw us in and realize that this is more of a mellow but serious kind of tone being presented. So some of the examples that I found, and each of the lines are labeled by number, which is just important to take into account, is that 9, the wind was bitter. 6, nevertheless I had acquaintances. Or line 54, it was cold there at 206 feet, and when I looked down, I was not encouraged. It definitely sets up the underlying message that the author is trying to essentially portray through his story. So some literary elements. Like I said, it's very, very rich in imagery. And again, the rest of the slide is going to be me reading off examples. So line 16, touching the side of the mountain, one feels coolness. Or line 17, peering into the mountain, one sees sparkling blue-white depths. Or line 26, in the streets were many people with disturbed eyes. Or line 28, in the streets there were hundreds of young people shooting up in doorways behind parked cars. I think it's very important to understand that imagery is supposed to represent the 5 senses, but we definitely get a more like bias weighting for, sight and touch. And it definitely affects the message and that the author is trying to get across. So similar to imagery, I think these work more as like complementary to each other, imagery and symbolism. And I can definitely tell that the lines that I've chosen, such as line 45, no one has ever climbed the mountain on behalf of science or in search of celebrity or because the mountain was a challenge. Or line 71, which I'll read part of it, which is the conventional symbol, such as the nightingale, often associated with melancholy, even though it is recognized only though agreement is not a sign, like the traffic light, because again, it presumably arouses deep feelings and is regarded as possessing properties behind what the eye alone sees. The use of symbolism also tries to help Barthelme explain essentially his message that he's trying to get across. So some connections to metafiction. So I think it's important to note that like all these elements are interconnected. You can't just solely analyze tone or solely analyze symbolism or imagery and essentially derive, theories and messages. It's something that definitely requires all of these elements to work together. So from there, we can end up essentially like describing the characteristics of metafiction, through these different literary devices. And some of them would include, and they're definitely not limited to, reflexivity, breaking the fourth wall, and challenging the reader through several aspects. In terms of reflexivity, it gets the reader to really think about, and reflect. Breaking the fourth wall, it's a bit of a stretch, but definitely some of the messaging that the main character had, definitely, and the descriptions definitely can essentially show that side or prove that side. And challenging the reader, that's almost what every single piece does in terms of metafiction. It really gets the reader to ask questions about their own views and perspectives and their interpretation of the texts. So after analyzing the primary characteristics of metafiction that show up in this text, I think the next question is, how does this piece impact us? So it's clear that the symbolism and imagery outlined gets us to visualize the hypothetical world created. And I don't mean this in a way where the reader actually believes that he's in the story, but it definitely gets the reader to position himself almost, like definitely understand what's going on. And I think the symbolism and imagery that I extensively mentioned helps a lot with that. Definitely, I think a good moment in the story is when the main character looks down, he sees people struggling with their day-to-day lives. So the main point that the author and the main character is trying to get across is it really gets the reader to understand essentially the different dynamics in society. So the final part of this presentation is going to be explaining how these metafictional elements can affect some of the theories that someone like me or even other people have debated. And again, there are many ways to analyze this, but I chose the top 3 that I felt reflected some of the examples of questions that readers can essentially assume and ponder on and try to answer. So the first one would be the short story uses metafictional elements to expose how society is deteriorating. And again, I'm going to use the line 28 where it's, in the streets were hundreds of young people shooting up in doorways behind parked cars. So I think this line definitely shows how everything may seem on the outside perfect. So in society, we tend to ignore a lot of different things that seem a bit like, if it doesn't fit with the trend that the overarching trend or idea that everything in society is great for everyone, then it tends to be ignored. But I felt like this line definitely shows that individuals can suffer, and definitely it takes a lot of discipline to really stare at that. Like I said, in this point, hundreds of young people shooting in doorways, like that's a real problem in society. And I think, or really believe, that the author shows how essentially these individual situations can definitely be neglected and exacerbate the deterioration of society. So the second theory would be that this has helped people reflect on the value of life and relationships. And again, this was a very weird plot twist, but line 98, I threw the beautiful princess head down the mountain to my acquaintances. At first, I was like, who would do that? And I think that's something a lot of readers would feel. So it shows that without hesitation, he's willing to get rid of her, and it shows the lack of morals presented in the story, because it has us question, essentially, what do we value in terms of our close friends and families, peers and strangers. And I think it really challenges the dynamic that we try to show as humans and individuals in society, between people we care about and even people we don't really know too well. So the main point that I am trying to get across is that this part of the metafictional elements definitely gets us to reflect on what we value and what we essentially want to cherish. So the third and final theory that I came up with, and I'm going to use two quotes to back it up, would be example, so line 55, a heap of corpses, both of horses and riders, ringed the bottom of the mountain, many dying men groaning there. Or line 78, my acquaintances were debating the question, which of them would get my apartment? So these two quotes definitely represents the greed that mankind faces when competing with limited sources. So it definitely shows that the people he's surrounded by probably don't care too much about him, and it definitely gets us as readers to understand try to understand what their intentions are and what they want. And by asking those questions in the story, it definitely gets us to question what other people would want with us in our lives, and what are their intentions and what are our intentions, and how does that essentially build or spoil, I could say spoil different relationships and the dynamics that we can have with people. So, beside these three theories, there are several more out there, but I think these are the three main ones that I wanted to focus on. And finally, I would have the sources, which are primarily just the images. The main sources I used was, the class lecture and the text, and also these are just meant to be the images for the whole thing. But anyways, thank you for watching and listening to my presentation, and I hope you learned a lot from it.